Welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you all today. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the director here at the Forum for Scholars and Publics, and we are so excited to greet today Raha Harfouch from Paris and Negar Motahadek, who many of you know, who's here at Duke University for a conversation, a pretty wide-ranging conversation about social media, outrage fatigue, democracy, activism, and kind of where we are in that configuration. Rahaf is an author, an entrepreneur. Her first book, Yes We Did, was about her work on the Obama campaign and social media. And more recently, she published a book called The Decoded Company, which was a bestseller on the New York Times and USA Today, and deals with social media and companies. And also the founder of Red company. And Negar is a professor here at Duke University of Literature, the author of multiple books and articles on Iranian film and culture, and most recently of a book called Iran Election about social media and the movement for democracy. So I'm going to pass around our mailing list. If you're not on it, please do sign up if you'd like. We don't send out too much email, but we have events here as well as events around campus on related issues of public scholarship, journalism, etc. And what we're going to do today is to kind of start with a conversation here amongst the panelists, and then move to the conversation with all of you. I think many people have their own thoughts and experiences around this topic. So to begin, what I actually wanted to do is to open up what you've offered to do for us, which is to try to explain and understand the particular configuration that we are in today, and the ways in which sort of social media and information around crisis in particular kind of happens, and how we respond to crisis through this configuration. So we're going to kind of talk about that configuration and what it is, and kind of let you explain this to us how it works.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you for the invitation. I'm so thrilled to be here, especially with one of my dearest friends, and so I'm very excited that this is part of the work. I wanted to start off by jumping into a bit of research that I had done around the times of the Paris attacks, when I realized that, because living in France, we had the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January, and then these unfortunate attacks later on in the year, and experiencing all of that as the place that I lived in, it felt very familiar to me in terms of the way people were reacting online. And this came about by, in all honesty, the fact that for days after the attacks, I couldn't really think about anything else. My productivity went down. I wasn't really in the mood to do much, and so I was consuming all of this information and reading all this information, and I started to realize that crisis, and the way that I've been following crisis online for the last couple of years, they tend to follow a very specific curve. There are different stages of the way that people react online now when one of these events happen. And more than that, technology today is actually reinforcing a lot of those norms. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But essentially there are 5 stages. The first one starts off as called first awareness, and that's generally, the theme of that is people are questioning, like, hey, is something happening in Paris? So with the shootings, when the attack started, for example, the first reactions, the first tweets that came about it was, something's happening at République. Something, question mark, is anyone else hearing these sirens? Is anybody else? So it was very much like, we know that we're not sure that something's going on, but something doesn't feel quite right. The second phase, to go back to to that one, perfect. The second phase is informational maelstrom, and that's when we know that something is going on, we know that it's bad, but we don't fully understand the whole situation. We know that there's something happening in Paris, we know that people are hurt, we know that emergency vehicles have been dispatched, we know that there's some sort of danger and drama and crisis, but we don't fully understand the who, the what, the why, or the injuries or the toll that it's taken. The next thing that happens is the narrative peak. And the narrative peak, if you remember, was on Saturday, where you woke up on Saturday morning, and then we knew at that point that there were X number of attacks and X number of people injured. We knew who would claim responsibility. We had a pretty good sense of what was happening. And now we moved on to analysis. We move on to away from trying to fact find and into trying to understand sort of what this contextually means for us as a people. And at this phase, we then enter the 2 sort of declining phases. The first one is solidarity. So once you have an understanding of what has happened, that's when people started tweeting or sharing their condolences, their experiences, their grief. There were solidarity marches. There were, the world monuments that were lit up in France's colors. And so all of these things to kind of express the emotional reaction to the full understanding of what had happened. And then finally, the last one is the moving forward, which is now people have gotten over their shock. There's an appropriate grieving period. And the moving forward piece is generally represented by after the last Memorial March or the final, honoring the victims. And then you start to see now conversations in the media about what next. Where do we go from here? What are we going to do? How are things going to be different? And it's almost the reestablishing of the new normal. And this cycle was followed during the Charlie Hebdo attack. It was followed after the January attacks. It's actually been followed in every single major crisis, whether it was natural or man-made or anything. And I think what's interesting about this particular one is that where we're talking about, outrage fatigue is how often it's now happening and how often we are now being pulled into these different areas of crises, whether it's the refugee crisis or, your friend that is sending you emails about SeaWorld or, PETA sending you emails about animal cruelty. It's how often we're kind of being engaged in these issues and what is the emotional toll that's having on our psyche, both as just consumers of media and then also as agents of democracy or people that are interested in impacting the systems that are governing our society.
Thank you. So your collaboration between the two of you, I think, kind of came about, and it's very rich in a lot of ways. And I wanted to turn back to sort of the era, the moment of 2008, 2009, when a lot of this configuration, you both argue, kind of emerged, right? In particular, so you're working with the Obama campaign in that period, the use of social media in politics, the work on the Iran crisis, which really changed the way Twitter worked. So if we can kind of think together about how to historicize this phenomenon that we're fully in now. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that moment of 08, 09 and kind of what happened and what changed and how that created this configuration.
No, you start. So it's really interesting the things that we don't remember about how social media was before and how it was used before it became a tool for activism and engagement on a global scale. So in the book, #IranElection, I describe a moment in the history of Twitter where really all we had done on Twitter was to follow each other and follow, like, I don't know, at what coffee shop. So we knew where everybody was on our Twitter feed. We knew who had what for breakfast and lunch and what they were reading. I mean, literally, that was all we had shared, and that with each other. And there was this sense of intimacy with the friend-follower networks in 2008, 2009, that really was the basis for what came in the context that it became the basis for trust within the context of online activism in the years that followed. So I think the 2009 Iranian post-election crisis, which was a crisis that erupted after Iranians recognized that their votes at the presidential election in the summer of 2009 had not been counted, right? And they went onto the streets and marched against the government and were all about reclaiming their votes. And they were attacked. And within, they were attacked by the government, and the government demanded that the marches, that there be no marches, there would be no uprising, and they started attacking people on the streets. And I think many of you remember that within a week of the Iranian post-election crisis, there was a video that circulated on Facebook and then on YouTube, and that then was streamed on CNN, and it was the YouTube of Neda Sultan, who had been shot down by one of the militia forces in Iran. What was interesting about the circulation of this video, I mean, or the history of this video, was that it was the first time that something from YouTube was being streamed on CNN. That there was that, I don't know, what they called amateur videos, where acceptable forms of documentation for mainstream media. And really, it was at this point in the history of mainstream media that social media became a thing. It became a focus of its attention. So once the crisis in Syria and Tunisia and Egypt happened, what we call the Arab Spring, it was the first place that mainstream media went. They called, the Egyptian revolution the Facebook revolution. But it really wasn't. I mean, the activists were talking about with each other on Facebook, but it was in fact the shutting down of the networks of the internet that brought people to the streets and pushed the revolution forward. I think one thing that I want to note about the Iranian election crisis online is that this curve did not occur at the time. I mean, it was a crisis that lasted. #Iran election trended for over a year on Twitter, and it only dipped momentarily when Michael Jackson died, 2 weeks into the crisis. And then it surfaced again right afterwards. And it really, after Michael Jackson, the Iranian post-election crisis, what was going on the ground in Iran, was under the aegis of Twitter and the hundreds of thousands of people who were tweeting information and sharing images from around the world, not just Iranians at the time. And I think that it was fundamentally this solidarity around the #Iran election that changed the way that we do activism on social media. And keep the attention on topics going on there.
I think what happened in Iran was so interesting because it predated the curve because it was one of the first. We talked about this yesterday, the idea, and again, we tend to forget the idea that Americans and Canadians would care so deeply about a political event that was happening in a country half a world away, in a country that had no diplomatic relations with the US. That I think was so interesting to me because it showed an openness to redefining what we considered issues that matter and issues that we were willing to take a stance on and willing to participate in. I mean, even you can argue somewhat slacktivist act of changing your avatar on Twitter to green. I found that to be quite interesting because it was the first time, that a teacher in Kansas was saying, I care enough about what was happening in Iran to make a statement to my own network about it. And it's one of the first, I think it's really one of the first issues in the 2008 election as well, was one of the first emergence of the application of micro-influence, this notion that we can use social media and that these platforms could be used not just to share information about our lives, but that could be used to influence the people around us in terms of opinions and with our political views and to rally them towards some sort of action. I mean, in 2008, Barack Obama was the first political candidate that was on Twitter. He was the first political candidate to have social networking profiles across the board. And I think it was this understanding that conversations were happening and that influence, the pools of influence were being created on these networks where the team quickly realized that this was the gateway to offline action. It was this recognition that our online activism could be linked to direct action, but you had to go through that online space in order to get there. And as more crises happened, eventually our reactions became more normalized under this curve, because we then understood what the response was. And if you could show the image of the Facebook, the Facebook avatar one, which is, I think, this one, right? No, keep going.
Oh, is this one?
Yeah.
No,
No,
that's
keep
not
going. This one. It's this one. So to show you how far we've come, so when people spontaneously decided to change their avatars to green in Iran, that was something that was not organized. That was something that was spontaneously spread. Now, after the Paris attacks, you had the ability through a Facebook feature that would automatically do it for you. But note the most interesting part is down here it says, when do you want to switch back to your previous profile picture? And it set an expiration date, meaning we already recognized that after 3 days or a week, we wanted to go back to that state. And that's an example of how technology is actively embracing the norms that we ourselves have created and then are continuing to influence and shape them. Because I know that I put, a week, even I was so devastated by the attack, recognized that there was a natural exit point to that, and that eventually we had to go back to normal to unfortunately wait until the start of the next crises came, and then, that the whole cycle will start over again.
I mean, by contrast, during the Iranian election crisis, which was 7 years ago, what happened, what you would get was a sous chef, a sous chef who's a politically motivated sous chef from Florida, talking to one of her followers, Annalisa, whose biggest ambition is to be an internet meme. And congratulating her on the tint of green on her avatar. I mean, it was literally this. There was this conversation about how you are standing in solidarity by actively choosing to keep your avatar green in support of Iran, and changing your time zone and your geolocation to cover up for or cover for those who were tweeting live from Iran.
I'm curious about, maybe we can circle back to this, but the kind of question, right, of the effect, right? I mean, obviously, in the Obama campaign, it has an effect, in Iran election, different kinds of effects. But I don't know, just from your own trajectories and experiences, whether you, going back to that moment, whether you were able to kind of see, or were there moments of realizations where you saw, oh yeah, this is actually doing something, right? Kind of clicks where because those were the moments where you became engaged in the kind of scholarship you're doing and work you're doing. So I don't know if there's any particular moments during that period where you kind of realized or perhaps saw forward about what was happening at the moment.
I mean, for me, it always goes back to micro-influence, right? It goes back to in time of crisis when everything is such chaos, there are such limited things that you can do. So in the Paris attacks, what was so powerful was people, so during the stage when there was a lot of chaos and the metro was shut down and people couldn't get home, the emergence of the porte ouverte hashtag, the open door hashtag, connecting people with places to stay. That was super powerful. The emergence of people offering, Airbnb coming online and saying we're going to offer free shelter for people that are stranded. So when people started posting pictures of their loved ones that were missing, and then other people were trying to match them and trying to help people find missing loved ones, I think for me, the action is really dependent on the goal that we're trying to get. In crisis, especially something like this, the only thing we can do is help each other get through it, compared to a political campaign or a revolution where you have a much more concrete goal. So the effectiveness was actually recognizing that there was a little bit that people can do. However, the flip side of that is for the open doors movement, so many people were tweeting about the fact that there was an open door hashtag that it actually made it harder for people that needed accommodations to find accommodation. So there is also a sense of, am I helping, or am I helping by spreading information, or am I just adding to this maelstrom where there's so much information around already?
Right.
So for me, looking back at the hashtag Iran election campaign on Twitter, there is a sense of sadness that comes over me, because thinking about what we didn't know we were doing. This was the first time we were engaging in this way with each other, and we actually thought at one moment that we were helping Iranians on the ground. And in some ways we were. We were spreading proxies that would allow Iranians to tweet and connect online. But we were doing other things like finding safe houses on Google Maps. Because what we had heard was that the wounded would be picked up once they got to the hospital and taken to prison rather than actually taken care of. And so we were so excited about these technologies that we were like scanning the Tehran's map for all the embassies that would be safe houses and calling them and making sure that they would take people in. And what we found was this, people on the ground actually know where to go. They know better than us looking at Google Earth. They know where to go. And that us tweeting this was actually handing over important critical information to government forces who are also viewing our Twitter streams. And so in some ways, and also, a lot of the information, people who only logged on 3 days later would be tweeting it as if what they're seeing is just happening now, and there was a lot of dated information that was being shared. And so looking back, there is the sense of, we really failed, but we also learned many lessons. And I think the biggest outcome of the Iranian post-election crisis, at least on Twitter and Facebook, was the real transformation of these platforms.
Right.
As a result of people's solidarity. So Google created an alpha tool for translation. So people on Facebook and Twitter could translate blogs and tweets and posts easily. Facebook allowed users to write in Persian, and there was a translation feature that came on within 4 days of the Iranian election crisis. So I think those were the big results, the transformation of this sphere.
Well, I mean, and as you show in your book, just literally the creation of the hashtag as what it becomes, right?
Yeah.
So there's kind of, I think this, the interplay between sort of activism in various forms and then the platforms is kind of critical. I was thinking about the form of micro-influence, which is, I think, you got her on Twitter, she got me on Twitter, and that original, that kind of, for better or worse, but that original, often it starts as a personal endorsement almost, right? You're saying this is a way that I think of engaging with politics. I want to try to, we talked about taking a little step back, because in your work you also make comparisons to the use of cassette tapes in the Islamic Revolution, right? And the question of how new is this, and how much is this one version of a much longer story of technology and news and information, maybe going back to the abolitionist movement or other forms of activism during the 20th century. And so is it a continuity in terms of the psychology and the questions and the politics of it? Or are we really living in a moment where things are really transformed in some way psychologically and in terms of the political implications? So, if you have thoughts on that.
I think elements are the same because everything builds on the rituals that we've had historically, but I really feel that it's a different age and a different moment only because of how connected we are as a global digital population. The idea that we're seeing citizen journalists that are posting videos from rural Damascus or from things that are happening halfway around the world, the idea that we are emotionally connected to through tweets and YouTube videos and Facebook posts, a very personal interpretation of events that are happening halfway across the world. I don't think that was possible. I think 15, 20 years ago I could read about a crisis, but I couldn't experience it through the eyes of so many other digital citizens. And we spoke a little bit earlier about this, how our brains, when one of your friends is really upset and they're crying or they're sad, your brain, the neurons in your brain mirror that response. You feel the same thing. Empathy is your ability to actually feel what they're feeling. And we're experiencing that on this constant level where you're not just reading about it in a newspaper, but you're watching videos, you're following live streams. You're seeing when the refugees were marching through Europe and they were updating their location on Google Maps. That was a very visceral response when people posted Instagram videos and periscopes of them being welcomed in real time. And that's the other element too, right? Not only are we connecting to stories through very unique perspectives, we're doing it in real time. So the sense of drama, the sense of uncertainty, the sense of fear as it's unfolding in front of our eyes, that I think has a huge emotional impact that wasn't available before. I think back to the Paris attacks and what was happening in the Bataclan, in the music hall. That hostage situation was developing in real time, and so I remember becoming obsessive compulsive about checking my phone to see, have they gone in, what is the death toll number, how many people are injured, and just continuously checking. And I think, and we can talk about this later, I think this speaks to the information and the psychology of our relationship with information, of why we're compelled to do that. But I feel like it's a very unique moment because we're emerging as this global internet culture that is changing the way we interact with each other.
I do. I was thinking that the Iranian post-election crisis of 2009 on a global scale So the way that Twitter and Facebook globally interacted with the crisis in Iran really mirrored how an earlier crisis in 2003 had been communicated for Iranians in Iran. So what Iranians, there was an uprising at Tehran University, and government sent in military forces and attacked the students. This was not being reported in mainstream media. It was not on television in news reports. So the way that the students got information about these attacks out of the country and into the world and to Iranians in Iran was to capture videos, send them abroad, email them abroad, and then have satellite stations in LA and London stream it back into Iran, so Iranians could actually see what was going on in their own country. So this model of going abroad in order to influence, to have impact on the population was mirrored also in the 2009 post-election crisis. But you also mentioned the cassette tapes of the 1979 revolution. So a lot of people refer to the Iranian revolution in 1979 that toppled the Iranian monarchy, a modernizing monarchy, in favor of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a theocracy essentially. They call it the cassette tape revolution, and this was because many clerics would record anti-government, sermons on cassette tapes and distribute them amongst the population. And in fact, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, before he became a supreme leader, he was in exile in Paris. And what he would do was give talks. His talks would be streamed out via telephone lines to Iran. They would be captured on cassette tapes, and the cassette tapes would be distributed. They would be re-recorded and distributed amongst the population. Literally, people would walk around with boom boxes on the streets, booming out his sermons on the streets of cities and towns in Iran. And this was what, this is oftentimes seen as the beginnings of the revolution. And it's interesting that these activities were then translated into how Iranians used YouTube and Twitter in their anti-government activities.
I mean, I think, and Raf, you're particularly concerned with these questions of the current moment of outrage fatigue, information overload, and maybe the difference that makes, right? So the particularities of this moment of excitement. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you're thinking, how you're thinking right now about how that sort of psychologically works, and the question of sort of individual agency in the face of this, and how it's, how it's transforming how we think about our agency.
Sure. So, I mean, I believe that one of the big reasons, or one of the underlying drivers that causes outrage fatigue, is that we have all this information, right? It's a nonstop flow of 24-hour news cycles and tweets, and you could spend all day, every day reading about everything and still sort of not feel like you know enough, right? And one of the reasons that I think that is because at least when I was growing up, and definitely for like our generation, we have been taught, everything that we've been taught about how we process information has been done in this environment of a staticness, right? You go into your, first year Psych 101 class and you get a textbook and you do the semester, and by the end you're at the end of the textbook and you have, reasonably you have everything that you need to know that makes you an expert in Psych 101, right? And that's how we have learned, that's how my parents read the newspapers, that's how I read books, that's how I consumed news for the longest time. And so that actually developed this expectation. We have this subconscious expectation for an end point. We think that at some point we're going to reach the end and then we will know. And the reality is that's not true anymore. We live in an ecosystem of an infinite amount. It's a very dynamic state where information itself is constantly flowing. And despite the fact that it's constantly flowing, we're struggling because even though rationally we know that we're never going to reach the end, I think some level psychologically we're consistent, we're keep struggling in finding the end. So one of the reasons why I feel like this fatigue happens is because there's so much information and we have this compulsion to go chase it. Now where I think that becomes dangerous in terms of agency is, I think one of the biggest drivers of stepping away from an issue is feeling like you have so much information that the issue becomes so abstract that there's no way for you to emotionally understand what is happening. And I'll use a very specific example, which is the Syrian refugee crisis. I am Syrian, so this is a cause that's obviously very concerning to me. And I remember there are days when I would stop reading the news because how could I emotionally process as a person the displacement of millions of people? I hear the facts and that doesn't mean anything to me on like a very emotional level. All I feel is overwhelmed and helpless and confused, and people are yelling in my ear and I'm seeing these very sad videos and I'm seeing all of these things, and it's very frightening and it's very destabilizing, it's very depressing. And so I think that if you're going to go back to the potential of what these platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and what they produce was this idea of micro-influence. And the reason why I think we are so outraged and we're so fatigued by this outrage is we have not developed the right actions yet to be able to translate that micro-agency in the face of all of this information. So the way that I kind of have made peace with it is I realized that I needed to actually tighten the scope. I didn't need to widen my search. I needed to bring everything down. So despite the fact that I donated to Amnesty International, donated to the UNHCR, what actually made me feel better, or the thing that was most effective, was the Canadian government has decided that they will accept 25,000 Syrian refugees in Canada. And as a part of a program outreach, they're asking families and private groups to sponsor each one family. So my family and an extended group of people in our network have decided to sponsor one Syrian family. And that is something that is on a small enough and a micro enough level that makes me feel like I'm having a very minute but at least a tangible impact. I'm going to see these people, we're going to help them settle, we're taking responsibility for them, there's all these things that we're going to do for them. And instead of worrying so much about the millions here and this and the billions of aid that's needed and all the stuff that I can't fix, it's almost about how do we bring it back down to one thing that we can do, this micro-influence, this micro-agency. And I feel and that's philosophy is how I started to approach all the causes that I want to support in my life. I can't rescue, every abandoned animal, but I can foster or I can sponsor one animal or one family or one cause. And the ability to do that has helped because for 2 years, and now almost 4 years, but for the last 2 years and watching the situation get so dire, I don't know if you felt the same way, but I can't handle any more. It's like the news has almost lost all meaning to me because it's like, I get it. One more crisis, one more family, one more image of a dead child, one more, we get it, it's horrible. And then we turn off the news and we look at each other and we say, okay, well, what can I do? And it's not just the Syrian crisis. After the Paris attacks, there were people that were saying, there were attacks in Lebanon, there were attacks in Kenya, and it was like everyone was saying, well, why aren't you changing your avatar, your Facebook profile to the Lebanese flag, or to the Kenyan flag, or whatever? And it's the same thing with school shootings. It's like eventually you start hearing the same piece of sad news over and over that it loses its ability to pull you. And that I think is really dangerous. So I believe we need to bring it back to this ability to how can we make this personal impact. And we spoke a little bit about the story of, you've heard the story about the guy who's walking along the beach and he sees another guy throwing starfish into the ocean. Have you guys ever heard that story? So he's throwing starfish into the ocean and this guy sees him and he comes up to him and he says, what are you doing? There's so many starfish that are washing up on shore. You can't possibly save all of them. And the man picks up one starfish and he throws it in the ocean. He said, well, I saved that one. And that's, I think, the perspective shift that we need, which is a bit at odds with the non-stop flow of information that we're getting bombarded with on a daily basis.
I do think, I think that's keen insight. I do also think that the story, the individual story, the personalizing of issues and products has also caught on for with companies and organizations where, you know, you get the story of the product and it's very personal. You see the product on Facebook and it looks like it's been captured on an iPhone. And the caption sounds very, I don't know, like it's someone has posted this as their personal story. So I think that, you know, there's also a way in which the story, the micro, gets abused on social media for the benefit of corporations and terrorist groups as well.
Yeah. I mean, it is, and that's because and that's the danger, right? It's like the tools that we're using to cope are also being co-opted by different people with different agendas. So and this goes back to like the psychology of information, where I don't feel like in schools or even I don't feel like anybody ever sat me down and said, let me teach you about how to process information in a critical way. Let me teach you that you have to question every source and question everything that you're reading and ask yourself, who is this person posting, and you know, what is their purpose, and all of those things. So it's also a gap in our skill sets to be able to cope, because when you're hearing something, especially whether it's a product in a first person narrative, I believe that as human beings we're inherently trusting when somebody comes and, you know, it's a very personal story. It's not necessarily our instinct to stop and say, wait a minute, is what you're telling me true? And in the Arab Spring, one of the biggest examples was, I don't know if you guys remember, but there was this blogger who came on who was in the LGBT community and was tweeting a lot about her insights on her life and the protests, and it turned out that that whole story was fabricated by a man who was like a PhD student in Scotland, that he had fabricated this entire blogger's life, and then he had fabricated the fact that she had gone missing, and so all of these activists were trying to look for her, and were like, you know, the people took great risks to their personal safety to go and like ask questions about where she was, and then for it to turn out to be untrue. I think that's the dark side of what you're talking about, is that there is a question of trust and of intention around it. And the same things, by the way, that pull us to our causes, you know, terrorist organizations like Daesh, they're also using the exact same thing. They're telling the same story in the same media, in the same way, in the same cycles, in order to create that emotional connection and encourage people to commit a very dangerous act, but that is categorized as microagency. What is a more empowering, if not disturbing, message than telling somebody to like go out and to wreak havoc in name of a political ideology, right? So it is both sides.
Well, thank you both. I think we'll open it up for questions and comments at this point.
Thomas Friedman in today's Times addresses the question of the role of social media with the Arab Spring. And the promise of the Arab Spring has not been fulfilled. He addresses why this is with regard to social media, because social media was so influential in beginning the movement. He makes the point that what happens apparently with social media of any significant event is that there becomes such a torrent of information from all sides and all sources that it becomes a babel. For example, governments have their own website, their own versions of events. Factions among the Islamic world, which you can speak to far better than I, have their own broadcasting, their own access to social media. So it seems then that, if you might consider that, with regard to the Arab Spring and social media, that social media eventually shoots itself in its own foot and becomes ineffective I'm just going to stop at this point. I'm going on too long. You get it.
There's a lot of potential in a lot of these tools, but you know, I think that just declaring something as arbitrarily failing or not is not necessarily the most accurate way to look at that situation. I think when you have a population that has been oppressed for decades and a regime that has perfected the arts of intimidation and terror, really, it takes, I don't expect people to execute on it perfectly. I think it was a prototype. I think it was an example. I think the fact that they tried speaks more to the potential of the internet to mobilize people around ideas. I don't look at their failure and say they failed. I look at their failure and I say, okay, clearly there's more learnings to be done because these are such new tools, and now we do need to face new challenges and how to deal with rumors and how do we keep each other safe. That being said, you can't completely say they're a failure, because I remember during the protests in Turkey, I was in IRC chats watching activists from Anonymous teaching other Turkish activists on the ground how to protect themselves, how to use proxies, how to use Tor, and seeing that real-time information, even across the Arab Spring. There was a lot of literature in Arabic that was being spread around, teaching people how do you protect yourself, how do you stay safe at rallies, what do you do? And so I look at it as just a prototype, because let's also remember that for every movement that is created, there are entrenched people with agendas that are very much like against having these changes take place, and those are the people that will shoot civilians and will torture and will kill, and like the internet can only kind of do so much in the face of that. But the fact that they're trying, I think, is very, I mean, and I'll tell you something about Syria. In Syria, a lot of the attitude there was that there was no point in trying because it was so locked down. So the fact, just the sheer fact that the internet was used to communicate the locations of rallies and to circulate, just the fact that they were open enough to the possibility to do that, I think indicates a huge shift in the population. But it's new, right? Somebody who's been under lock and key for decades is not going to suddenly be able to come forward and like create a whole new movement, right? Look at how many, the French Republic, look at how many failed cycles they had to go to before coming up with some sort of stable entity. So that's mine. I'm not saying it's a perfect tool, it's not a unicorn, but I think we are making advances. They're just baby steps, and it's going to take a lot longer than I think many people would like or would hope. I don't know what you think about
Well,
that.
I was just thinking about, you know, the criticism that is oftentimes leveled at social media is as if we're talking about some kind of institution that's creating a babble. It's actually the human players who are using these social tools that are acting in an unconscious way with regard to what they are posting and tweeting and retweeting. So yeah, it becomes babble when one post gets reposted over and over again and no one's actually read through the entire article or hasn't like actually considered whether or not this picture was photoshopped, or if it was from this event or from another event. Do you see what I mean? It's that we act unthinkingly with regards to this tool. It's not that the tool is necessarily faulty. Technology is technology. It's how we use it and how we interact with it. What we decide to like and not like, post and not post, that's determining. And it also determines how these platforms function ultimately. What we do will determine what Facebook does next.
My question's about Activism. So my assumption has been that most of the people who are doing these sort of bare minimum efforts to make a statement are people who would otherwise be doing nothing. And so in that sense, it's relatively harmless. But I'm wondering if there are any data to suggest that some of the people who are doing this bare minimum are people who would otherwise, if it weren't possible to get away with doing almost nothing, would actually be doing more, in which case it essentially is a harmful thing, because now resources and energy and effort that could have been channeled towards actually having significant impact are really sort of going down to the lowest common denominator. Let's just change our Facebook avatar and call it good.
Remember how I'm the optimist here?
Which is very weird. I'm supposed to be the pessimist, and here I am being like, come on. But I think that's true, but I also think the Slacktivism is a response to like a broader, access to a broader base of causes. So before, if it was something that I was protesting like in my city or in my country or with my government, Like that was something that I had agency to be able to go and do. And in that respect, I think social media on a local level has been shown to be quite powerful in organizing people around a cause where they have power, whether it's electing a new representative or whatnot. Where it gets a bit trickier is when you get back to the sense of this global sense. I'll give you an example. There was last July, this outrage over in China. There's this like horrible thing called the Yulin Dog Festival. I told you about this. I called her like crying, being like, I can't believe this. Basically what they do is they like eat 10,000 dogs. And Ricky Gervais, who's a huge animal activist and comedian, tweeted out about how outraged he was, and it spawned all of these actions where people were changing their avatar pictures to stop Yulin. But most interesting to me, they were creating this petition to petition the Chinese government to intervene. And people were like, that's not how the Chinese government works. Like, they don't care for citizens that are not in their country to be, you know, to talk to them about like issues. But so in that sense, you know, you change your avatar pictures. I retweeted a thing, but like I didn't sign any petitions because I understand that like I have no agency in foreign policy. If anything, I think the action should have been to communicate my displeasure to like the foreign minister, the foreign policy minister in Canada, and then have him, you know, to put pressure on the ability that we can do it. So I actually think that it depends when you're looking at like what's the cause. Like you remember the Coney 2012. It's like what else are people going to do when we don't have it. The type of like legislative process power to be able to impact things. All we can do is work with the mechanisms that we've built within our own government systems, right? So I don't think that it's more harmful. I just think it results to more outrage fatigue, because after you've seen your 100th petition and your 100th avatar and your 100th this, it might actually just desensitize you to issues in general, because you think to yourself, well, who cares what my actions are going to do? So in that respect, I think it's super important for us to reframe activism within the context of what we can actually do, even if the actions are more mundane, like calling a representative the way, you know, in the net neutrality debate where people actually vote. Like calling your representative is not as sexy as, you know, changing your avatar or posting a sad video, but it was the thing that needed to be done in order for action to happen, and it worked. Versus just concentrating on providing people with a very limited set of behaviors for them to engage in an issue.
I just remember the state of despair that I was in after hashtag Coney 2012. And for those of you who remember, this was a video that was circulated on Facebook and Twitter with, you know, the producers of the film, you know, contacted key influencers on these networks and shared this video and had them share it with their friends and followers. And there was a toolkit for activists that came, you know, that you could, I don't know, is it you could get it for $1 or something?
You could get like a sticker to post on a tree or something. Just.
And I did. It was just a toolkit on how to become an activist. And the point was that once you had this toolkit, there was a particular day that you would go out and take action, was to take back the night and to make Joseph Kony famous by posting these placards on streets and walls everywhere. So that didn't happen. Right? People did download these toolkits, but the actual painting of the walls, of actual city walls, didn't happen. And I just remember the state of despair that I was in. And, you know, this is typical, it was like the first signs of activism in 2012. But in the end, I think the campaign succeeded in the sense that they did make Joseph Kony famous. Right? They made it known that he was recruiting children as soldiers in his campaign. So, I don't know. I'm trying.
Wait, you're the optimist? Not Rich. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
But if I recall correctly, I think Invisible Children actually like commercialized activism, right, in that campaign, and the walls kind of fell down around them when people saw how much money they were actually donating to the cause, opposed to how much the CEO made and the CFO and everyone in the organization. So I think that like, how do you get around that dangerous part of internet activism, right? Where you can't, like, yes, we know about Joseph Kony now, we know about the atrocities that have been committed, but also we were used, right? And everybody that bought that kit fell victim to this crime of deceit, right? And so how do we do good in areas where we don't have like the physical autonomy to get out into the streets and do something, but also know that we're not doing harm as well, right, in our actions?
I think this shifts this, like the part of the conversation about the skills that we need to process information. I think now, as a way to deal with information overload, we're moving towards sources of information that provide context. And there's a bunch of sites now, for example, that pull a lot of data and that help you decide which charities to support based on, it's like a big list, and based on how much money goes to the cause, based on their rating of actually executing on their promises, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that kind of, I think this space has created the emergence of new tools and services that are needed to navigate, because otherwise you're being asked to trust. And this is especially true even, I don't know if you remember, there was like a Kickstarter campaign that was started for like this homeless guy, and people were going to buy him a car and whatever, and then it was later revealed that the guy who raised all this money never gave the money to the intended recipient. So I think we are seeing, remember that the internet and everything on it is a neutral tool for, it all depends on the intent of the people that are using it. And it is being used equally, I think, for good and for evil. I think it's split right down the middle. But I think that the solution to that is to start building and being a part of these like context creating tools that say, okay, before I donate, before I act, and I've started to do this myself, there's a certain set of due diligence that I'm going to have to do. Much like I now know, because after the Paris attacks, and people were tweeting all sorts of things that weren't true, and that was actually creating panic. Like people were tweeting that there was additional attacks and additional shootings, like learning, and one of the ones that they tweeted was like so close to where my house was that I remember just being petrified and saying to myself, I'm never again just going to trust unverified information. From now on, whether it's a research report or a charity or a viral video, whatever it is, I'm going to do my due diligence in order to like make sure that this is okay. Because also think of how many viral videos kind of circulated and then turned out to be hoaxes, or how many of them turned out to be marketing campaigns that were going to elicit. Do you remember a couple of years ago, I think this is like 2006, I think, 2007 or 8, where there was that video of that bride who was freaking out on her wedding day, and she like cut off all her hair, and it went viral, and it turned out it was an ad for shampoo. So I've also become now where I see a viral video, like a lot of the times I will, before I'm like, oh my God, look at this, I'll have to stop and ask myself, like, is this fake, is this not fake? So the answer to your question, I think, is developing this new suite of tools to be able to navigate, where unfortunately, like, you have to question everything and look down, track the sources and track everything. And sometimes you will be taken advantage of, but that shouldn't stop you from donating to causes that have been vetted. It just means that we're going to have to get better at like vetting them as a part of our regular internet experience.
I think the bigger question is whether or not social media is the site for the convergence of a political will. Is this where we can assess public opinion? Is this a place where we can measure the political will to act on behalf of people? And for now, I have to say, as the optimist here,
The designated optimist.
that it's not. And I say that in part because of the curation of conversations on platforms like Twitter by key influencers, institutions such as CNN, and celebrities such as Kim Kardashian. And so basically the curation of conversation by key influencers and their followers thoughtless retweeting and liking and favoriting and retweeting of them. And in part, I think I say this because of the presence of algorithms that determine what people see and what they don't see and what they ultimately share or not share. And so I think it's hard to actually say that we can assess a political will for change, any kind of change on social media now. I think there was a momentary opening, but it was around 2008 and 2009. For now, I think I would retract from this site as a real site of possibility.
I don't know if I agree with that actually, only because I think that but only because I think that the internet reflects our human behavior, and in history it's always like the small hyper-motivated minorities that have pushed things through, whether it was like, I remember when I was living in Toronto, I had this one woman who lived 2 houses down from me who was like very upset about like the size of the garbage bins being put up, like something, the size of the garbage bins being put up on the street, and she was like knocking at my door and wanted to have these conversations and doing all of these things, but like she ended up being instrumental in pushing this new city council policy through, or and we ended up kind of being pulled along. But I don't necessarily think that that's like, I'm not idealistic in the sense that I don't think that it's going to be these large movements. Sometimes it happens historically when there's a convergence of a pain point where it hurts enough people and enough people are inconvenienced that they are pushed to make a change. But we've always seen, Margaret Mead has always said, never doubt the power or the influence of a small group of people. So even when you look at revolutions, or even when you look at these big movements, I think as long as it empowers those individual people to find each other, then there's a potential there. But I don't have the expectation that it's going to be this like sweeping, global reform where all of these people are going to do it, at least not until things get worse. Because it's kind of like the Armageddon situation where it's like everyone's going to ignore the problem until the asteroid is like about to hit the planet, and then suddenly everyone is motivated enough to kind of try to get it done. But this is human nature. We won't shift, we won't move, we don't want to change our behavior, we don't want to be uncomfortable. So until we actually feel the pain of not doing something that's going to push us to it, then we're going to be activated into doing something. And until then, I think these tools are to empower small groups of people that are hyper motivated. I mean, when you look at the net neutrality debate and like the freedom of the Freedom Internet, or the Freedom Internet Society, or whatever group I was getting emails from, it's like they were hyper into it, but I eventually ended up responding to their intensity. So I wasn't as active, but I did make a few calls. I ended up making like 2 phone calls about the cause in order to throw my voice in, and I needed their intensity to kind of pull me along. But I don't think it would be fair for me to expect that I would become as high a level activist in that cause, because to be quite honest, I wasn't feeling the pain point enough for me to care. Like it wasn't impacting me on a personal level enough for me to be forced to adapt my behavior. So I think it's these tools are always going to impact our behavior. It's like the people that are getting down on gossip blogs, as though if gossip blogs didn't exist, everyone would be reading The Economist or something. The people who are reading gossip blogs are the same people who are picking up People magazine. Like the intent was still there, it's just delivered in a different format. So,
you had a question?
Yes. I absolutely agree with the idea of this digital pedagogy.
Bye guys, thanks for coming.
My point would be about I want to challenge this idea of global reach, because I'm not sure if we are talking only about one audience, which is maybe the US and some other countries in Europe, those who speak English, some institutions. You said CNN and you said Kim Kardashian, both from the US. So, and inversely, we have Paris. Okay, it's Paris. So all the world was concerned about Paris. But last week again, Boko Haram again, and that it doesn't become global. So how are we measuring it? Is it only in one language? Is it only from who is the audience? So maybe that question of how are we really measuring this idea of global can have some answers, but maybe there are others.
I mean, it's not necessarily just crisis. When I mean global reach, I mean think about the World Cup and how during the World Cup there were people across languages, across countries, and different territories that were all not necessarily a crisis, but that we're all tweeting or sharing about the same information. It's about this possibility that technology has created a way for us to globally experience an event in a way that wasn't possible before, or even like the death of Steve Jobs or the royal wedding, where you saw cross-language posts being made. I would actually argue that the lack of response to Boko Haram is more of a symptom of outrage fatigue than anything else, because we hear about horrible things happening in Boko Haram like every single day. And much like, unfortunately, when I read about a car exploding in Iraq, or another more soldiers dying in Afghanistan or whatnot, or another school shooting in the US, I'm concerned, but unfortunately the level of outrage that I feel has been muted by the fact that I have been overexposed to these types of events. So when I think about how we're going to measure it, I just look at technology's reach and being able to tap different markets, different languages, different demographics even around one specific issue. And like the World Cup is one of the most interesting studies, because there have been analysis on how different markets and different languages and different demographics react to, whether it's their language, whether it's their behavior and how they use social media and all that different type of stuff. So we know that the reach is there. Paris was a great example.
Can I say something about it? But the World Cup was already global before the social media.
Yeah.
Actually, in all the countries out of the US, is the most important event ever.
Yeah.
Now it's globally exciting.
Yeah.
Because we're on Twitter talking about it.
Yes. That was global before, that's my point.
So is outrage fatigue new?
I don't know. I mean, I think there must have probably been a time when people got tired of reading about the war in Iraq, the war. I mean, the earliest example that I found of the term being used was a 2004 article in The Onion saying something like 70% of liberals are suffering outrage fatigue because like there's so much drama happening on the political scene that they like no longer care. I don't think that it's necessarily new. I think it's becoming more intense as the cycles between events get shorter and shorter.
I wonder if it depends on how old the person is, too. My grandfather and I stood in the front yard and looked at Neil Armstrong on the moon. We couldn't see him, but there he was. And I said, "What do you think, Rappy?" And he says, "I remember when the Wright brothers flew the first plane." There's a little timing perspective. I grew up in a household where we did not have a television technology until I was 6. So now I wonder sometimes about outrage fatigue, if it's a function, because I'm certainly tired. I thought this was the age of Aquarius, and it isn't. I think it's. I think that it's the immediacy. Your little timeline, 12%, 12%, and 75%, not to scale. I think it's real squash, and the frequency. Maybe the world has always been this crazy, but I didn't have to know. That makes me tired.
I mean, the research shows that technically we are living in like a very prosperous time, and looking at statistics, it's like that, there's never been more stable, governments, never been more peace. I know it doesn't feel that way, but we're consistently being told that that's the truth, and I think it's this ability that we are so exposed to all of this information all the time that I can find out about a horrible festival in China, or about, a marine park in the U.S., or about a horrible that blogger in Saudi Arabia.
The poverty rate in Durham County.
Yeah.
You don't have to go very far.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, why don't we take the two questions back there?
Okay, so like earlier in the discussion, we were talking about the sense that we have to, everything that we read online has to be read in a sort of skeptical way to sort of digest the intentions and the source of it. And I'm just sort of like thinking back to like my experience growing up, like I was raised in an education where where reading a newspaper, you were meant to read it skeptically. Everything that people said, you were meant to digest it skeptically and have like an own opinion. So I'm interested to hear what you think. What makes why are we having this discussion now in terms of we need to take internet media and internet information seriously, when the whole time it's sort of been inculcated in our growing up process that we have to take everything differently. What makes internet media different and special in that way?
I think it's the expansion of authority. I think traditionally you were reading a book, or you're reading a newspaper by a journalist, or you were reading a report by a scientist. So there was, even though you had to read it skeptically, there was an implicit assumption that the person just by the sheer access to the technology to allow them, whether it was the printing press or, you know, the newspaper, there was almost like an intermediary that said, we're gonna vouch for this person because, you know, you're a reporter for a newspaper or whatnot. And now with publishing platforms where literally anyone can say an opinion about anything, I think it's just changed our perception of who is an authoritative figure and who is not. And again, it goes back to the psychology of information, where even though we know we're supposed to be skeptical, I think there's like embedded subconscious bias to taking something more seriously if you see it in print, or if you read it in a book, or if you consume it in a form of traditional media, because those are the people that have been experts, and we have been taught in school, you know, the textbooks, the books, the readings, like to question, but to question what they're saying, but not to necessarily question their right to say it as an expert in that space. And now that that's shifted, I think it means that every blog post, every tweet, every Instagram post, I mean, who are these people? Everyone has kind of claimed this level of authority that was, you know, before mediated by the presence of these like barriers, editors and agents, and, you know, think of all the processes all the steps and the hoops you'd have to jump through in order to get a book published. And now you can publish a book in like an hour by uploading it on Amazon. So,
I mean, there are processes by which that are followed by journalists when they write an article for the verification of a news item, right? And that's lost when a citizen journalist is reporting his or her eyewitness account. I remember that as Israel was mobilizing the public to post things in defense of Israel during the crisis in Gaza, not last summer but the summer before, there were actually journalists on Facebook teaching Palestinian citizen journalists how to write and verify the news that they were reporting. And I found that shift so beautiful, because it was a recognition on the part of mainstream media that it didn't have the kind of access that citizen journalists had, but that citizen journalists didn't have the tools to verify the information that they were posting as eyewitness reports. I just thought that was a very beautiful moment in social media history.
Okay, so I was going to return to something that I think we talked a little bit about earlier, but so we've talked a lot about using these tools for communication and information and kind of the cascading power they have, but I'm interested in using these tools for distributing action. Like we know that the real stuff happens in 300-page trade agreements that none of us can see, or in these legislative, these bills that have all kinds of stuff snuck into them that we don't know about until the vote happens or whatever. And I'm wondering if there are examples of using these distributed tools to say, we want everybody to read one page of this thing really closely and look for these things, and then here's what you can do with that information that's actionable. Not just kind of raising awareness, but turning that awareness into like using the tools to kind of make more efficient distributed action. I can't think of any good examples of that myself, but I'm wondering if you have some, or if there are ways you think we could take that, what starts as outrage, and turn it into something that is more than just changing a profile picture.
I just remember when Anders Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist, attacked the children that were on an island in Norway, future politicians, that people had downloaded his manifesto and were reading it bit by bit and recognizing the influence of key conservatives in America and Europe in his document, like that he had taken pages from the Unabomber's manifesto and taken op-ed pieces from various political sources.
Similar with the Charleston shooter, right? Who people found was really interested in the Rhodesian flag and sort of South African conservative movements, and then there was a good post on Africa as a country kind of tracing that. I mean, at least those are genealogies, right? As opposed, they're not exactly actionable, but they were
Well, from an actual perspective, I think about like the Edward Snowden leaks and how journalists collaborated together to parse through everything and analyze it. I think of WikiLeaks and like the Stratfor emails that were leaked and how there were hundreds of thousands of emails or Cablegate, and then people came in and started tagging and organizing and making it easier to sift through so that you could go and say, show me every single email that was about this topic or during this timeline. So that is existing in the parsing of information. And the best example, honestly, the 2008 Obama, the strategy behind that campaign, what made it so brilliant, is that they understood that their goal was always offline action. Where other campaigns wanted to use like the splashiness of social media, they knew that they needed to do a couple of things. They need to get people to register to vote, they need to get people to vote, and they need to get people to donate money and get their friends to vote. Like those were like the 4 core activities that have not changed since the beginning of elections. They just recognized that every single piece of marketing or of strategy that they did online was always linked to some type of offline action. So they quickly recognized that they needed to drive offline behavior, and the online tools were just the means to do it. So you would get an email, but the email would say, donate $5 or make a phone call or do something. And that's where I see like the prototyping, where we're still kind of learning, because the Obama campaign was interesting in the sense that in 2008, they were the first campaign that used tools in this way. So what happened in 2012 when the Republicans and everyone was using these tools, and then in 2012 it was like data, right, and being able to analyze, and then now in 2016 everyone's got social media and everyone's got data. So we also, from an ecosystem perspective, is that every time it evolves, all the players must also evolve, and things that worked in 2008 would not work in 2016 because the entire landscape is different.
In an election year, I mean, this is an election year too, and people are getting really passionate about particular candidates, and in some sense, I think we tend to anthropomorphize the issues we're interested in those people, and think, if I vote for Bernie Sanders, then everything's going to be just how I want it. But unless you also vote for all the representatives in the House of Representatives and the Senate and so on that will enable Bernie Sanders to do the things he's talking about, you're not going to accomplish too much. And I'm wondering, the extent to which people who are running these kinds of campaigns can do that pivot from, you're outraged about X, you're going to vote for Y, but you also need to vote for all these other people, for all these other ideas that will push this whole idea forward, and don't just focus on this one person or this one campaign or this one issue or this one outrage.
Well, and after the election in 2008, the thing that a lot of people felt was that they felt disappointed in the sense that after President Obama was elected, that there wasn't more that they could do. And I think it was so new that they weren't thinking about that at the time, but I think they missed this big opportunity to continue to engage people, because they were flying so high on that election that had he said, okay, now we need to do this representative and this issue and that thing, I think that could have happened, but they never did that. So you had this whole peak that kind of died, and then I think they found it a bit more difficult to re-engage the base in 2012.
Yeah.
So then that goes to say, like, do we need to be continuously engaged at certain levels in order to not let it die too much? Or does that produce a different type of fatigue?
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much for this. This has been a great discussion.